The Supreme Court chamber was so quiet you could hear someone breathe. Every camera, every eye, every heartbeat was focused on one woman, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. She stood tall at the council table, her voice calm but her eyes full of fire. Across from her sat Justice Samuel Alito, a man known for interrupting lawyers before they could finish a single thought. He had already cut her off 3 times in less than 5 minutes. But this time, something different was about to happen. What took place in the next 30 seconds would not only silence the justice, it would echo through American history and change the way people looked at the right to vote. The country was divided again. People everywhere were arguing about voting rights. Some said new laws were needed to keep elections safe. Others said those laws made it harder for honest citizens to vote. Inside the Supreme Court, that argument had come to its final and most important battle. At the center stood Jasmine Crockett, a congresswoman, a lawyer, and a fighter for fairness. Before joining Congress, she had worked as a public defender, standing beside people who had nothing and no one to fight for them. She had seen how laws could protect people, but also how they could be used to hurt them. Now she stood in the highest court of the land, ready to prove one thing, that the Constitution still belonged to the people, not the politicians. Justice Samuel Alito was powerful and well-known. For months he had been making public speeches that sounded more political than judicial. He had openly criticized efforts to expand voting rights, raising questions about whether he could truly be fair in this case. Many Americans wondered if he had already made up his mind. When Crockett began her argument, Alito leaned forward and frowned. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said sharply, "that's not what the Constitution says." His tone was cold, dismissive, and final. The words hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Reporters in the back froze. Lawyers shifted in their seats. But Crockett didn't flinch. She looked him straight in the eye and said softly, "Justice Alito, with respect, I believe the Constitution says a lot more than you're reading." Her voice was calm, but her confidence filled the room. People leaned in. They could feel something special was happening. She began again, her tone slower and steadier. "The right to vote," she said, "is the right that protects every other right. When 53,000 people in Jefferson County were stopped from voting, that wasn't just unfair. It was unconstitutional." The Chief Justice leaned forward slightly. Other justices nodded. But Justice Alito interrupted again. "These are minor inconveniences," he said. "The Constitution gives states the power to run their own elections." Crockett paused, her hands resting on the table. When she spoke again, her words were simple and strong. "With respect, Justice Alito, the Constitution also gives the people protection from the misuse of that power. Article 1 cannot be read alone. The 14th and 15th Amendments changed everything." She went on to explain in plain language how the Reconstruction Amendments, the ones written after the Civil War, were created to protect all citizens, especially freed slaves, from unfair state laws. She told the court how those amendments gave the federal government the duty to defend the right to vote. Her voice was clear and full of purpose. Even people who didn't understand legal talk could follow her meaning. Justice Alito frowned again. "The Constitution does not guarantee convenience, Congresswoman," he said. "It divides authority, and that authority belongs to the states." But this time Crockett didn't answer right away. Slowly, she opened the brown leather portfolio that had been sitting quietly in front of her. The sound of the clasp echoed through the silent courtroom. From that folder, she pulled out a single sheet of paper. Every eye in the room followed her hands. She looked directly at Justice Alito, the man who had interrupted her again and again, and said in a steady voice, "Justice Alito, you often talk about the original meaning of the Constitution. I'd like to share what the original framers of the 15th Amendment actually said." The audience held its breath. She lifted the paper, its edges slightly yellowed. A copy from the congressional debates of 1869. Then she began to read. Senator Oliver Morton, she said, stated that the purpose of this amendment was to place the power of protecting the right to vote in the hands of the federal government, where it rightfully belongs, rather than leaving it to the states, which have shown themselves unworthy of that trust. Gasps filled the room. Justice Alito shifted in his chair. Crockett continued. Representative James Garfield, who later became president, said during these same debates that the time has come to set a rule that will override all state laws that burden the right to vote. Her voice never shook. Then she turned to a second page. Senator William Stewart, one of the amendment's writers, explained that this was not just about banning racial barriers. It was about making sure every citizen could vote freely, no matter their station in life. The courtroom fell completely silent. Even Justice Alito had no words. The other justices leaned forward to see the document. The Chief Justice signaled to a clerk, who quickly began making copies. Crockett looked around the chamber, then back at the bench. "These are not my opinions," she said. "They are the words of the framers themselves. They show that the Constitution was never meant to give states unlimited power. It was meant to protect the people from that power." Justice Alito tried to regain control. "These are interesting historical notes, counsel," he said, "but they don't override the plain text of Article 1. Crockett didn't hesitate. "They're not notes, Justice Alito," she said calmly. "They're history, and history is the foundation of law." Her voice was soft, but her words cut like a blade. Everyone could feel it. The Chief Justice looked thoughtful. Even some of the conservative justices leaned back, realizing the depth of what she had uncovered. Crockett continued. "The framers of these amendments knew that some states would use new rules to block certain voters. That's why they gave Congress and the courts the power to step in. This case isn't about convenience versus security. It's about whether every citizen has a real chance to be heard." Then she presented the evidence. In Jefferson County, 83% of the voters turned away were minorities. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern. And the framers of the 15th Amendment would have called that exactly what it is, a violation of the right to vote. The Chief Justice looked at her, then at Justice Alito. The air in the courtroom felt heavy and electric at the same time. Then something rare happened. The Chief Justice spoke. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, "you may continue." He was giving her extra time, something that almost never happens in the Supreme Court. It was a clear sign that her argument had struck deep. Crockett nodded once, then continued, her voice now stronger and more passionate. "The Reconstruction Amendments weren't a footnote to the Constitution," she said. "They were its rebirth. They redefined freedom, and they made the right to vote the heart of that freedom. If we read Article 1 today, as if the Reconstruction Amendments never existed, we aren't being faithful to the Constitution. We're being selective with it. And selective constitutionalism is not justice. It's power without principle." The words landed like thunder. People in the audience exchanged stunned looks. Reporters scribbled furiously. Law clerks stopped typing just to listen. Even Justice Thomas, who rarely spoke, lifted his head. Crockett brought her argument to a close. "This case is not about which political side wins," she said quietly. "It's about whether the promise of America still means something. The framers of the 15th Amendment would recognize exactly what is happening in Jefferson County today. The question is, will we have the constitutional courage to see it as clearly as they did?" When she finished, the room stayed silent. No one moved. Justice Alito's expression was tight, unreadable. But everyone could see that his confidence had cracked. Crockett gathered her papers and walked back to her seat. The moment she sat down, it felt like the air itself had changed. For the first time in years, people in that chamber had seen not just a lawyer, not just a politician, but a leader who spoke truth with grace and courage. Outside, reporters waited. Soon the world would hear about the Crockett moment, the day a congresswoman stood before the highest court in the land and reminded everyone what justice really means. But inside the chamber, the silence said it all. Jasmine Crockett had not just argued a case. She had made history, and what happened next, 3 months later, would shock the nation even more. The news spread fast. Within hours, clips of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's powerful courtroom moment were playing across every major news network. Commentators called it the day truth spoke, louder than power. Legal experts described it as one of the most commanding arguments ever delivered before the Supreme Court. But for millions of ordinary Americans, it was more than a legal story. It was a story about hope. People who had felt ignored finally saw someone stand up for them, calmly, confidently, and with undeniable facts. Across the country, viewers replayed that moment when Justice Alito fell silent. It wasn't just about winning a debate. It was about restoring faith that fairness could still exist at the highest levels of law. Inside Washington, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters surrounded the Supreme Court steps. They asked, did Congresswoman Crockett just change the future of voting rights? Many believed she did. Even those who had disagreed with her before couldn't deny her command of history, her steady voice, and the undeniable power of her evidence. Late that night, anchors replayed her final line again and again. The question is, will we have the constitutional courage to see it as clearly as they did? People across America felt those words. In the weeks that followed, legal scholars dug deep into the history Crockett had brought to light. Law professors from top universities studied her sources, the very words of the framers of the Reconstruction Amendments, and realized that much of that evidence had been sitting unnoticed for decades. The Harvard Law Review published a special issue about it, calling her argument a landmark moment in constitutional interpretation. Professor Akila Marr of Yale Law School wrote, Crockett didn't just argue a case. She resurrected forgotten truths. He explained that her method of using originalist history to defend voting rights was something new, a bridge between conservative and liberal thought. She had shown that protecting voting rights wasn't a modern invention. It was built into the original purpose of the amendments written after the Civil War. As the country waited for the Supreme Court's decision, tensions grew. News outlets ran countdowns. Activists and lawmakers debated. Some said the court would never side with her. Others believed that even the most conservative justices couldn't ignore the strength of her evidence. In Jefferson County, where the lawsuit began, people gathered in churches, community centers, and town halls, praying that their voices would finally be heard. Then, 3 months later, the decision arrived. It was a warm morning in Washington. The courtroom was full again. Cameras waited outside. When the Chief Justice began reading the opinion, the entire country listened. The decision was 6-3. Congresswoman Crockett had won. The court struck down the restrictive voting law and announced a new national standard for voting rights. The Chief Justice's words were simple but powerful. He wrote, when a state's voting regulations result in clear disparities in access to the ballot, courts must apply heightened scrutiny. The right to vote, being preservative of all other rights, demands the highest constitutional protection. It was a moment that stunned the nation. Even more surprising, Justice Samuel Alito, the man who had challenged Crockett so sharply in court, wrote a concurring opinion instead of a dissent. For years, he had opposed limits on state authority over elections. But in this case, he acknowledged that the historical evidence she presented was compelling and instructive. He wrote, the record brought forth in this litigation sheds new light on the original understanding of the Reconstruction Amendments. That sentence changed everything. A conservative justice, long seen as immovable, had shifted his stance because one woman had brought the truth straight from the pages of history. Legal experts called it a constitutional earthquake. Nina Totenberg from NPR called it the most significant voting rights decision in a generation. Law scholar Richard Hazen wrote, "Crockett didn't just win a case. She rewrote the rules of the debate." And across the country, people celebrated. In Jefferson County, voters lined up at City Hall, many holding handmade signs that said, "Thank you, Jasmine." Some of them had been turned away from the polls in the last election. Now they knew things were finally changing. One woman, a retired teacher, told a local reporter, "For the first time in years, I feel like my vote will count again." The impact didn't stop there. The Supreme Court's decision forced every state to review its voting laws. Legislatures across the country began rewriting voter ID rules to make them fairer and easier to follow. Some states even formed bipartisan commissions to ensure that voting was both secure and accessible. What had started as one case had now become a movement. Inside Congress, Crockett stayed humble. When reporters asked how it felt to change history, she simply said, "It wasn't about me. It was about the Constitution and the people it protects." But behind the scenes, she had become one of the most respected voices in Washington. Her careful mix of legal expertise and moral clarity had won the admiration of both parties. She was invited to speak at law schools, civic groups, and even judicial conferences. At one event, a former Supreme Court clerk asked her, "How did you stay so calm when Justice Alito interrupted you?" Crockett smiled and said, "You stay calm when you know the truth is on your side." The audience stood and applauded for nearly a minute. 2 months after the decision, something else happened, something even more unexpected. The Supreme Court announced the adoption of its first ever binding code of conduct. It included new rules about public appearances, stricter recusal guidelines, and stronger transparency requirements. No one officially said it was because of the Crockett hearing, but everyone knew her confrontation with Justice Alito had sparked the change. The moment she held up that historic document in court had shown the nation that even the highest judges must answer to the principles of fairness and integrity. Meanwhile, law schools across America saw a surge in applications, especially from women and students of color. Many applicants wrote in their essays that Jasmine Crockett's Supreme Court argument had inspired them. Professors began referring to her approach as the Crockett method, the practice of using clear, simple historical evidence to uncover the true meaning of constitutional rights. Law clinics at major universities created projects to continue her work, digging into forgotten congressional records to better understand the roots of other amendments. In Jefferson County, voter turnout rose dramatically in the next election. Churches offered rides to the polls, and community centers stayed open late to help people register. Voters who had once felt hopeless now felt powerful again. The local newspaper wrote, "The Crockett case didn't just change the law, it changed people's faith in democracy." Even Justice Alito seemed changed. When Crockett returned to the Supreme Court 2 years later to argue another case, he treated her with genuine respect. Observers noticed that his tone was calmer, his questions more thoughtful. It was clear he had been deeply moved by that first encounter. During one exchange, he even referenced her earlier argument, saying, "As Congresswoman Crockett reminded this court in her previous appearance." The audience murmured softly. It was a sign that even the most unyielding minds could evolve. Over time, the decision came to be taught in law schools as one of the defining moments of modern constitutional law. Professors told students, "This is how history and justice meet." They explained how Crockett's method had reminded the court and the nation that the Constitution is not frozen in 1787. It lives and grows through every generation that adds to its sea. Promise, Crockett's influence reached far beyond the courtroom. Civic organizations launched Vote with Courage campaigns based on her closing line. Documentaries and news specials told her story to millions of viewers. Her face appeared on magazine covers, but she always brought the focus back to the people she fought for. In one interview, she said softly, Every time someone casts a vote who couldn't before, that's the real victory. The rest is just history. Even her critics admitted she had changed the conversation. At a Federalist Society conference the following year, prominent conservative scholar Randy Barnett said, "Crockett reminded us that intellectual honesty means following the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere we didn't expect." It was a rare moment of unity in a country often divided. Years later, when people looked back at that day in the Supreme Court, they remembered not just the silence of Justice Alito, but the strength of a woman who believed in the Constitution deeply enough to challenge those who had forgotten its meaning. They remembered how one voice, calm, clear, and unwavering, could still cut through the noise of politics and remind a nation of its promise. In classrooms and documentaries, her final words were played again and again. The framers of the 15th Amendment would recognize exactly what is happening today. The question is whether we have the constitutional courage to see it as clearly as they did. That question still echoed through America, a gentle but firm reminder that democracy only survives when people defend it. And as the credits would roll on the video of her story, the narrator's voice would return, quiet, reflective and strong. One woman, one courtroom, one voice of truth. She didn't just change the law, she reminded a nation what justice sounds like. Months after the landmark decision, life slowly returned to its usual rhythm in Washington, but something deep had shifted in the country's spirit. News programs that normally focused on conflict began running stories about community groups rebuilding trust in the voting process. In small towns, people organized local democracy days, where citizens gathered to talk about how to keep elections fair and open. The change wasn't dramatic or loud. It was quiet, steady and hopeful, just like the tone Jasmine Crockett had carried into that courtroom. Crockett herself rarely spoke about her victory. When she did, she gave credit to the generations before her, to the civil rights lawyers who had marched, to the teachers who had risked their jobs to register voters, and to the ordinary citizens who had believed in change even when the odds were against them. In interviews, she often said, "I just finished the work that others started." People loved her humility. It reminded them that real leadership isn't about fame. It's about service. Across universities, young law students quoted her lines during class debates. Professors encouraged them to study her method: clear facts, calm delivery, moral conviction. Some called it constitutional storytelling. They explained that Crockett had shown how history could speak in a human voice, not just in legal terms. The idea caught on fast. Soon, law clinics from Harvard to Howard began new research projects exploring forgotten debates from the Reconstruction era. Each discovery built on the foundation she had laid. Meanwhile, in Jefferson County, the place where it all began, the next election looked completely different. Polling places had more workers, better systems, and clearer information. Long lines were gone. People smiled as they left the booths. Local reporters interviewed first-time voters who said they had been inspired by the woman who stood up to the court. It was proof that change wasn't just possible. It was happening, right in front of them. Even in the Supreme Court, a quieter transformation was unfolding. Clerks noticed that discussions during conferences were more respectful. Justices who had once dismissed historical arguments now asked deeper questions about context. The atmosphere was still serious, but it carried less sharpness, more curiosity. One clerk later said, "After Crockett's argument, everyone started listening a little more carefully, to each other and to history." In the media, people continued to debate her legacy. Some said she had revived faith in the courts. Others said she had reminded Americans that democracy itself could still evolve. Late-night hosts joked that Crockett made even the Supreme Court blush, but behind the laughter was admiration. Viewers knew she had done something rare. She had spoken truth with grace, and everyone had heard it. As the second anniversary of the decision approached, A documentary team followed Crockett back to the Supreme Court steps. Standing in the same place where she had once faced the cameras, she looked up at the tall marble columns and smiled. "This building belongs to the people," she said softly. "It's here to serve them, not the other way around." The director captured that moment perfectly, the wind moving through her hair, the quiet strength in her face, the sense that justice was something alive, not locked away in books. The film aired on PBS under the title The Courage to See Clearly. It opened with her famous line and ended with images of voters walking into polling stations across America. Critics called it the most inspiring civic story of the decade. Viewers, especially older Americans, felt proud again. Many wrote letters to the network, saying the story had reminded them of the marches, the speeches, and the hope they had once carried in their youth. Meanwhile, Congress passed a bipartisan bill to strengthen voting protections nationwide. Lawmakers from both sides cited the Supreme Court's ruling as their model. When the bill was signed, Crockett was invited to attend the ceremony. Cameras flashed as she stood quietly behind the president. She didn't smile for attention. She smiled for what the moment meant. The right to vote once again had been honored. Years later, when people looked back at that time, they didn't remember the political noise or the headlines. They remembered the silence that filled the Supreme Court when one woman stood up and let the words of history speak for themselves. They remembered the calm in her voice, the steady strength in her eyes, and the way truth had a sound all its own. Schools began teaching the Crockett decision, alongside Brown v. Board of Education and Roe v. Wade. Students learned how a single argument could transform the law and the national conscience at once. In civics classes, teachers played the recording of her closing line, letting the words echo through the room before the bell rang. Some students would later say that was the moment they decided to become lawyers, teachers, or public servants. As for Justice Alito, he retired a few years after the case. In his final speech, he surprised many by mentioning Crockett's name. "History," he said, "is a teacher that never stops speaking. Sometimes we just need someone brave enough to make us listen." The audience gave a long, respectful applause. It was an unexpected act of grace, a full-circle moment for a man, and a court forever changed. Jasmine Crockett continued to serve in Congress, but she also began mentoring young attorneys, teaching them how to balance passion with patience. In her speeches, she often repeated a simple message: the law is only as strong as the hearts that believe in it. Her words became a mantra for new generations of advocates, and so, the story of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett became more than a court case. It became a lesson that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply stands steady and sure, and speaks the truth everyone has forgotten. Her legacy lived not just in books or rulings, but in every ballot cast, every voice heard, and every person who believed that justice could still be fair. The camera fades from her face to an image of the Supreme Court glowing under the evening sky. The narrator's final words echo gently. In a world full of noise, one voice can still make silence powerful. One moment can still remind us who we are, and one act of courage can still make history. The sun dipped low over Washington that evening, turning the white marble of the Supreme Court golden. The city was quiet, but inside countless homes across America, the story of Jasmine Crockett was still playing, still echoing. It wasn't just about laws or politics anymore. It was about courage, about truth, about one woman who refused to back down when it mattered most. Her story reminded people of something simple, yet powerful. Justice is not just written on paper, it's written in the hearts of those who believe in fairness. Every voice counts, every vote matters, and sometimes all it takes is one person to remind a nation of its promise. As the camera pans upward, the narrator's voice softens. The Constitution was never meant to be silent. It was meant to speak for the people. And that day, in one quiet courtroom, it finally did. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a case, she reignited a belief that truth can still rise, that justice can still stand tall, and that one voice can still make history. And maybe that's what makes this story so powerful. Because no matter how divided things may seem, there's still hope. There's still courage. And there are still people who will stand up when it matters. Now, if this story moved you, if it reminded you that truth still matters, take a second right now to hit the like button so more people can discover it. And if you believe stories like this one deserve to be told, stories of courage, truth and real change, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next powerful moment we bring to light. Together, we can keep these stories alive, the stories that remind us who we are and what we're still capable of. Because justice isn't history. It's happening right now. Thank you for watching. Like, share, and subscribe to stay inspired. New stories every week, right here.